Moving on from cells, today's lecture is going to focus on connective tissue, and connective tissue is one of the 4 different types of tissue that we can find within the human body. Now, connective tissue can get a little bit tricky because within the broad classification of connective tissue are a number of different subtypes. So we can have fibrous or dense connective tissue, and this is the tissue that forms things like our tendons and our ligaments. We have loose connective tissue, which holds our organs together and often sits underneath the skin. We have blood, which is a special form of a fluid connective tissue. Bone is a connective tissue, as is cartilage, and as is adipose tissue or fat. Now, even though we have all of those different types of connective tissue to focus on today, we actually only have 3 learning objectives to cover. So what is connective tissue and what are its functions? We want to be able to name and describe the 3 components that make up all connective tissue, and name and describe the different classifications of that connective tissue. So getting started, what is connective tissue and what are some of its functions? So connective tissue is one of the 4 main classes of tissue found within the human body. The 4 main types are connective tissue, which is the focus of today, our epithelial tissue, our muscle tissue, and our nervous tissue. Now, if we think back to our cells lecture and think about, well, where does tissue fit? So our cellular level, which is what we talked about in the last lecture, is just below our tissue level. So a collection of cells will form a tissue. A collection of tissues will form an organ. So just to quickly give you a brief rundown of these other tissues, we will obviously cover them in more detail later on in the semester, but just so you can see how they differ from connective tissue, epithelial tissue is the body's protection against the outside world. So for example, our skin is made up of epithelial tissue. Our skin helps monitor and control the temperature. It resists cuts and abrasions. It resists foreign bodies or damaging chemicals. And then internally, epithelial tissue lines most of our internal cavities. Muscle tissue can be divided into skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And muscle tissue is contractile, so it allows locomotion or movement of the body, as well as contractions in a number of vital organs. So think our heart, diaphragm, stomach, intestines. They all have really important contractions to allow us to survive. The nervous tissue makes up the body's electrical system, and what conducts those electrical signals or those electrical messages from our brain to our various organs and vice versa. Our connective tissue, as the name somewhat suggests, helps hold the body together. It connects our tissues and our organs. So as I mentioned at the start of the lecture, connective tissue is a bit of an umbrella term that encompasses a really wide variety of different tissue types. For this reason, the functions of connective tissue are really varied. The different types of connective tissue include loose and dense connective tissue, adipose tissue, cartilage, bone, and blood, and each of those will have a different function. Connective tissue is very widely distributed throughout the body and is often found within or surrounding other types of tissue. So it's not a tissue that typically sits out on its own. Some of the functions of connective tissue include providing support, protection, and structure to other tissues and organs. We can store fat as energy. Our blood helps transport nutrients and wastes. And it also helps the repair of damaged tissue. Now, as we learn more about the various types or classifications of connective tissue in this lecture, I'm sure more and more functions will become apparent. So I want you to come back to this learning objective when we're finished. Now, despite the different classifications of connective tissue being very structurally and functionally different, all connective tissues are derived from the same embryonic tissue. So from the same tissue in a developing fetus. That tissue is what we call mesenchyme. So up the top here. Now, mesenchyme is just a collection of undifferentiated cells from which all connective tissues are later derived. We also have clusters of mesenchymal cells scattered throughout adult tissue, and these supply the cells required for regeneration or replacement of connective tissue after you've had an injury. So walking you through this diagram, all connective tissue begins as undifferentiated mesenchyme. This just means it is cells that have not matured or grown into what they will finally end up being. So they have the ability to differentiate or to develop into a number of different types of cells. These cells can include fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts, and hematopoietic stem cells. Remembering, blast refers to an immature cell. So fibro refers to fibrous tissue. So this is an immature cell of fibrous tissue. Chond refers to cartilage, so an immature cartilage cell. Ost refers to bone, so an immature bone cell. And heme means blood, so this is a blood stem cell. When each of these cells develop, they then become sites. Remembering, site means mature cell, so a fibrocyte, a chondrocyte, and osteocyte. And this one's a little bit different. This develops into our different types of blood cells. So we have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So from there, this figure then goes into the different classifications of the different types of connective tissue. And so that's going to be the focus of our last learning objective. So I'm actually going to come back to this diagram. So our second learning objective is to name and describe the three components that make up all of the connective tissue, except for blood. So there's always an exception. This exception is blood. So the three components that make up all connective tissue, except for blood, are ground substance, protein fibers, and cells. The exception of blood contains ground substance and cells, but because it's a fluid, it doesn't contain those fibers, so it lacks fiber. The relative amount and composition of each component, so of the ground substance, the fibers, and the cells, will be different depending on the function of that connective tissue. So for example, ground substance in bone is mineralized, which makes it really hard, and that's important because we want the skeleton to have a supportive and a protective function. If we think about the aorta, so the aorta is the large blood vessel that exits the heart. When your heart pumps, it needs to stretch to accommodate all the blood coming out of your heart. So the elastic tissue within the heart, the elastic connective tissue, contains many elastic protein fibers so that it can stretch and then recoil with each heartbeat. So within our connective tissue, we have ground substance, we have fibers, and we have cells. And we will elaborate on each of these more in the next slide. But the ground substance and the fibers combined are what we call the extracellular matrix. So the ground substance and the fibers make up the extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix is simply the non-cellular component of all connective tissue. It not only provides the physical scaffolding of the connective tissue, but it also creates the optimum biochemical environment for the cells in that connective tissue to function. So taking a closer look at each of those components, and we'll start with ground substance. And ground substance is a clear gel-like substance that's found in between the protein fibers and the cells. It's made up of largely water, so over 90% water, as well as proteoglycans and cell adhesion proteins, which act as a bit of a glue for the cells in that extracellular matrix. The purpose of ground substance is to allow for the exchange of cellular nutrients and wastes between the cells and the capillaries within that connective tissue. So taking a look at this image on the right of the screen here, it's a picture of loose connective tissue, and you can see the fibers really quite clearly. These thin darker purple lines are our reticular fibres, and our thicker, slightly lighter pink are our collagen fibres, so they're two different types of fibres. The little purple circles are our cells, so in this case they are fibroblasts. And then the space in between, so the space in between the fibres and the cells, it's kind of the white colour here, will be our ground substance. So now taking a closer look at the fibres. Fibres are the other component along with the ground substance that make up the extracellular matrix, and it's the fibres that provide the structural support of that connective tissue, the scaffolding of that connective tissue. Now, there are three different types of fibres that can be found within connective tissue, and the relative amount of each fibre type will depend on the function of that particular connective tissue. So the first type of fibre that we're going to look at is our collagen fibre. And collagen fibres are large, as you saw in the previous image, strong fibres, made up mostly of type 1 collagen. They provide tensile strength to the extracellular matrix. They're present in both dense and loose connective tissue, as well as the special connective tissues such as cartilage. So think of a tendon, for example. A tendon's role is to connect a muscle to a bone. It needs to resist a lot of force because when your muscle contracts really strongly, it pulls on the bone to create movement. That tendon needs to be really strong to stay connected to both the muscle and the bone. Tendons are made up of lots and lots of collagen fibres because the collagen fibres are so strong. The next type of fibre that we're going to look at is elastic fibre, and the name gives you a bit of a hint as to the function of the fibre. So elastic fibres are thin branching type fibres, and they're made up mostly of the protein elastin. Elastic fibres allow the extracellular matrix to stretch, but probably more importantly, actually recoil to its original shape. So if you think of an elastic band, you can stretch it, but it's actually more important that it returns to its original shape. Elastic fibres are found in varying amounts in different types of connective tissue, with some examples including tissue found in the aorta, so that's the big blood vessel exiting the heart that we talked about a few slides ago, in the lungs, so when we breathe in and we breathe out, our lungs need to expand and then recoil, in our skin, and also in our vocal cords. The third type of fibre within a connective tissue is a reticular fibre, and reticular fibres are very thin, delicate fibres made up mostly of type 3 collagen, and they kind of cross over to form a bit of a supporting meshwork, typically around our soft organs. So think about the organs like your liver, your spleen, your lymph nodes. Reticular fibres act as scaffolding or a framework. So taking a look at what those fibres actually look like under a microscope. So on the left, if I can grab my mouse, on the left is the image that we saw before. So we said those darker, lighter pink lines are our thick, strong collagen fibres, and the thinner fibres are those delicate, branching reticular fibres. The image in the middle is our elastic fibres, so you can see how they're structured all kind of coiled or wavy up, so that allows the fibres or the extracellular matrix to stretch out and then return back to shape. And then the image on the right is our reticular connective tissue. So these darker lines are our reticular fibres. Remember, they're the delicate branching type fibres, and the ones that often provide that framework for our soft organs. The lighter purple colours are just the different cells that will sit within that extracellular matrix. So our cells then are the functioning living portion of the connective tissue, and we can have specialised connective tissue cells within the extracellular matrix, and they are cells that are only found in one particular type of connective tissue. So think the osteoblasts and osteocytes are only found in bone tissue. Our chondroblasts and chondrocytes only found within cartilage. But then in other connective tissues, there's going to be a mix of different common types of cells. So these are cells like fibroblasts, mast cells, plasma cells, macrophages, adipocytes or fat cells, and leukocytes. And our leukocytes are white blood cells. So the most common cell found within connective tissue is what we call a fibroblast. So fibroblasts produce the collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers, as well as that ground substance. So they're clearly really important, and it's obvious why they're the most common in our connective tissue. Fibroblasts are large, kind of flat, although it's hard to tell from this image, what we call spindle-shaped cells that have processes, so these bits here, extending out from the cell body. The nucleus in the middle is an oval shape, but it's quite flat. Active fibroblasts are the functioning fibroblasts, and when fibroblasts become inactive, we then term them fibrocytes. So it's the immature cell that actually does the production of the different types of fibers and the ground substance. Our mature fibrocells, so our fibrocytes, are concerned with the maintenance of connective tissue and the connective tissue metabolism. Now, because they function to produce those protein fibers and the ground substance, active fibroblasts can be recognized under a microscope by their abundant rough endoplasmic reticulum. So remember back to our cells lecture, our rough endoplasmic reticulum is the organelle that produces protein for use within and outside of the cell. So if we're producing all those protein, collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers, we're going to need lots and lots of rough endoplasmic reticulum. A mast cell is another cell that is quite common within connective tissue. Mast cells mediate inflammatory responses such as an allergic reaction. Mast cells are scattered throughout the connective tissues of the body, particularly beneath the surface of the skin, near blood vessels and lymph vessels, within the nerves, throughout the respiratory system, and in the digestive and urinary tracts. So this is where you'll typically see inflammation or an allergic response. Now, within mast cells, we have many granules, and granules are just small, compact particles of a particular substance. In mast cells, granules contain chemicals, so things like histamine, interleukins, heparin, and a number of different types of enzymes. When the body or a particular tissue comes into contact with an allergen, the mast cells will release the contents of these granules. So you can see in the image down here, these green parts are our granules. They're containing the chemicals, so for example, our histamine. When that cell comes into contact with an antigen, which is an allergen, say this part here, it causes degranulation, which just causes that granule to spit out its contents into the extracellular fluid. So these chemical contents will mediate local changes, so changes within the immediate environment, which you will know as characteristic of an allergic reaction. So increased permeability of blood vessels, so that leads to your inflammation and your swelling. It causes contraction of smooth muscles, particularly in the airways, so think when you've had asthma or hay fever and you're really struggling to breathe, as well as things like increased mucus production. Now, as I said, one of the chemicals that mediate this response is called histamine, and hence why you take an antihistamine when you have hay fever or some other allergic response. So it's trying to reduce the impact of histamine. To give you a bit of a visual of the role of the mast cell in an allergic response, I have provided you this diagram. So if we start at the top here, we've got a B cell, and a B cell is a type of white blood cell obviously found within the blood. And in this example, this pollen here, the yellow little star, is our allergen. So the first time a person allergic to this particular pollen comes into contact with that allergen, our plasma cells, which are another type of white blood cell, produce a large number of antibodies for that protein. Antibodies are Y-shaped proteins that are made specifically in response to a particular allergen or a particular pathogen. How they work is that they will recognize that allergen or the pathogen when it enters the body. It will stick to that allergen and it helps the body with its immune response. So the first time a person comes into contact with an allergen, it creates these antibodies for that particular allergen, so for this ragweed pollen. These antibodies will attach themselves to the mast cells on the plasma membrane on the exterior surface, so that the second time that person comes into contact with that allergen, the allergen will bind to those antibodies on the surface of the mast cell, causing that degranulation, so causing the mast cell to release those different chemicals, and we get that allergic response. So this is why when people have a second or a third exposure to a particular allergy, so if you think of, for example, young children, when they're just starting solids and you have to slowly introduce them to different foods that are common allergies, think eggs and nuts. The first time they have that particular food, they might only get a little bit of a rash. The second or third time, because their body's created those antibodies and the mast cells are ready and prepared, the second time they're exposed to that allergen, they're going to have a much greater response. So really important to repeatedly test potentially allergic foods on young children. So related, another type of cell in connective tissue is our plasma cell. And as I just described, plasma cells secrete large quantities of proteins called antibodies. Now, plasma cells produce the antibodies in response to a particular antigen. So antigens are peripheral proteins that stick out of the plasma membrane on the allergen. So when we talked about cells, we talked about the plasma membrane, and I said there are particular proteins that stick out of the plasma membrane on the external part of the cell, and it helps the body recognize common cells or own cells and foreign cells. So they are called antigens. The body will make an antibody, or plasma cells will make an antibody specific to that antigen. A plasma cell will release its antibodies into the blood and lymph tissue, where it will circulate around the body. It will bind to the antigen of the allergen or the pathogen, and it helps either neutralize or destroy the pathogen, or it just helps assist the immune system in some other way of destroying that particular allergen. Plasma cells only live between a few days to a few months, but they will keep secreting antibodies until that allergen or until that pathogen has been overcome. So in that time, in a maximum time of a couple of months, a plasma cell can make up to several thousand antibodies. So again, just showing this image and where that all fits in. So our plasma cell here is what produces the antibodies. It produces the antibodies in response to the antigen on the allergen, so in this case, the ragweed pollen. These will now float around in the blood as well as attach to the mast cell and be ready to create that allergic response to neutralize that allergen or the pathogen. Another type of cell found in connective tissue, which is also part of the immune system, so there's a bit of a theme going on here, is a macrophage. So macrophages are specialized cells involved in the detection, phagocytosis, which we'll talk about in a second, but that's basically the engulfing of something, and destruction of bacteria and harmful organisms. So how macrophages work is that they will identify a bacteria or a foreign substance from those peripheral proteins or the antigens on the surface of that substance. They will surround and engulf or eat that substance, thereby destroying it. They can then also initiate the action of other immune cells, so set other things in motion so that foreign substance doesn't cause any more damage. Macrophages will engulf and destroy basically any tissue or substance that is not healthy. So that can include your own tissue in things like cancer cells or damaged cells, but also external things like microbes and other foreign substances. The process of engulfing and destroying the unhealthy or the foreign cells is called phagocytosis. So phag means eating, O is that combining word, site is cell, and osis is an action. So it's the action of eating the cells. So to give you another visual of that process, our green guy here is our phagocyte or our macrophage. This is our pathogen. These are the peripheral proteins sticking out on the pathogen or our antigens. They will come into contact with the receptors on the plasma membrane of the macrophage or that phagocyte. When the antigen and that receptor binds, it causes the macrophage or the phagocyte to engulf. So see how it surrounds and starts to ingest or eat that pathogen. Within our phagocyte or our macrophage, we have lots and lots of lysosomes. So remember, lysosomes are our suicide cells that have lots of digestive enzymes. So once that pathogen is engulfed or ingested, we open up all of those digestive enzymes and it will destroy that pathogen. The other really cool part that, or how macrophages work, is they can actually take a little bit of this destroyed pathogen, a little bit of protein, and then stick it on the surface of the cell. So back here where we have receptors for the antigens for particular pathogens, this is how it will recognize that pathogen should it ever come into contact with it again. So I thought that's pretty neat. So another connective tissue cell is an adipocyte, which is also known as a lipocyte. So lipo, adipo, both mean fat, or just colloquially termed a fat cell. Adipocytes are cells which are specialized to store energy as fat, and the fat is stored mainly in the form of triglycerides. Adipocytes can store large amounts of triglycerides and can provide the body's energy for long periods of time. So that's why when people go missing and they don't eat for a couple of days, even up to a couple of weeks, they can survive because we can use that stored triglyceride. Interestingly, our adipocytes typically do not proliferate or make more. So when a person stores more fat, so in the case of, say, obesity, this is done largely through hypertrophy or an increase in size of the fat cells, not that we actually create more fat cells. So if we have a look at this image here, these big white circles are our fat cells. If a person was to use that energy or to lose weight, these fat cells would just become flatter and thinner and not actually reduce in number at all. The last cell found in connective tissue that we'll talk about today is a leukocyte. This is another white blood cell involved in an immune response. And leukocytes work to defend the body against infection and disease by either ingesting foreign materials, by destroying infectious agents and cancer cells, or by producing antibodies. So leukocytes are actually a collection of different white blood cells. Now, there are two different types of leukocytes. We have granulocytes and we have agranulocytes. The name makes it really easy here. Granulocytes contain granules in their cytoplasm. So those small compact areas of a particular substance. Agranulocytes do not have granules. Now, each different type of granulocyte and agranulocyte plays a slightly different role in fighting infection and disease. The three different types of our granulocytes are our neutrophils, our eosinophils, and our basophils. The types of agranulocytes we have are our monocytes and our lymphocytes. Now, I'm not going to go into any more detail about how each of these work because the immune system is not a learning objective for this topic. However, you do need to know that they are blood cells and they are white blood cells. So if you ever see any of these terms, I want you to be able to recognize them as white blood cells and that they are going to have a role in our immune system. So now we know what connective tissue is and what it does. We know what it's made up of. We're now going to look at how we classify the different types of connective tissue. So for me, the best way to organise the various different types of connective tissue is to use a figure like this. Now, I like to see the big picture and where everything fits. If that's how your brain works, that's fantastic. I recommend you trying to replicate a figure like this on your own. If it doesn't work for you, you need to find something that does. That could be writing out a brief description of each type of connective tissue. It could be drawing a mind map. It could be filling out a table. Now, if you're struggling with ways to study this information, please send me an email or come and see me, because I have loads of ideas and suggestions. But as with every topic in this unit, you need to find a way that this is going to get stuck in your head. So, connective tissue, how do we classify it? So, the first, classification of connective tissue is that we have proper connective tissue and we have specialised connective tissue. Proper connective tissue are our more common types of connective tissue, and they're found in many places throughout the body. Our specialised connective tissue is only found in the one particular type of tissue. So we only find cartilage in cartilage, we only find bone in bone, we only find blood in blood. Our proper connective tissue can then be divided into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And this is based on the composition or the makeup of that tissue. So as the name suggests, loose connective tissue has lots of ground substance and very few fibres. So it's quite a loose arrangement of the fibres within that tissue. In dense connective tissue, we have less ground substance, but there are lots and lots of fibres packed in really closely. So it's a more dense tissue. With our specialised connective tissue, we can divide it into the three different types. So we have our cartilage, our bone, and our blood. We can then go into a bit more detail. So our loose connective tissue can be further divided into three different types. So we have areola, we have adipose, and we have reticular connective tissue. Now we're going to talk about these in more detail in the coming slides, but very quickly, our areola connective tissue has loosely organised interlacing fibres. Our adipose tissue, we should know, is our fat tissue. And our reticular connective tissue is made up predominantly of those reticular fibres in that mesh-like pattern. Our dense connective tissue is also divided into three different types of connective tissue. So we have regular, we have irregular, and we have elastic. And again, this is based on the predominant fibre type as well as the organisation of those fibres. So our regular connective tissue is made up of mostly collagen fibres, and they're arranged really nice and neatly in a parallel fashion. Our irregular connective tissue is also made up mostly of collagen fibres, but this time not in parallel, so it's a bit of a mess how they're all arranged. Our elastic connective tissue is made up of mostly elastic fibres. So this obviously allows that tissue to stretch and recoil. Our cartilage can be divided into three different types of tissue. So we have elastic cartilage, hyaline cartilage, and fibrocartilage. And again, I'll give you some examples on the next few slides. Our bone, which we won't talk in too much detail today because that's actually the topic of the next lecture, is compact and spongy. So that's two different types of bone. And then our blood is just our blood. So we have our red blood cells, our white blood cells, our platelets, but it's all encompassed under blood. So taking a closer look at the loose connective tissue, and a nice way to describe loose connective tissue is that it has more ground substance with fewer fibres. The three different types of loose connective tissue are areola, adipose, and reticular connective tissue. This image here on the left is the areola connective tissue. This image here is our adipose connective tissue, and this is our reticular connective tissue. And I should just point out, I am not going to give you a slide like this and ask you to identify each of the types of connective tissue, but sometimes understanding what it looks like will give you an idea of what the function is. So loose connective tissue is often found between organs, where it can act as a bit of a shock absorber. It can also help bind tissues together. And because of the large amount of ground substance and the fewer number of fibres, loose connective tissue also allows things like water, salts, and various nutrients to diffuse really easily throughout the tissue. So looking at those three different types of connective tissue, we have areola, and it's that interlacing, loosely organised fibres with abundant blood vessels. And so not all of our connective tissue has abundant blood vessels. That's quite important. It also has lots and lots of ground substance. Areolar tissue typically attaches epithelial tissue to underlying tissue. So that's like our skin, our organs, and our blood vessels. Adipose tissue is made up of a loose collection of those adipocytes embedded in a mesh of collagen fibres. When someone is storing a lot of energy, those adipocytes will be nice and round. When someone has fewer triglycerides stored, those adipocytes will be flatter and thinner. The function of our adipose connective tissue is simply to store excess energy, to act as a bit of a cushion around particular organs, so particularly our kidneys. You can knock your kidneys quite easily on the back of your, kind of just underneath your ribs. They can act as insulation as well. So some examples are our bone marrow. So our yellow bone marrow is mostly adipose tissue, surrounding our organs like our heart and our kidneys, and then underneath our skin. So think our cheeks, our butt, our thighs, our arms all contain that adipose tissue. Now, we actually have a few different types of adipocytes of fat cells. We have white fat, we have brown fat, and quite recently we've also discovered that we have beige adipocytes or beige fat, which is a bit of a combination of the two. Now, these different types of fat are found in different parts of the body and at different times throughout the lifespan. So for example, we have a lot more brown fat when we are younger, when we are babies, because its main function is to generate heat. Babies have a lot larger surface area compared to the overall size of the baby, so this is really important in babies. Our white fat has other functions like that cushioning, like that insulation, less so about the heat production. And the beige adipocytes have a bit of a function of each. Now, we're not actually going to cover or assess the different types of fat in this unit, but in other units you might actually see these referred to. So I just wanted to make you aware that they do exist. So our last type of loose connective tissue was our reticular, and this is that branched mesh-like pattern of predominantly reticular fibres, and they form that skeleton or that scaffolding to support our different organs, and particularly our soft organs. So our kidney, sorry I've missed an R there, our liver, our spleen, and our lymph nodes. So then onto our dense connective tissue, and from this image here you can already see the difference between our dense and our loose connective tissue. It's made up of way more fibres and way less ground substance, and those fibres are arranged in a really orderly, tightly packed way. So the three types of fibres are our regular, irregular, and elastic. We have our regular dense connective tissue here, so fibres arranged really nicely in parallel. We have our irregular connective tissue, so those collagen fibres are kind of a little bit all over the place, but they're still quite tightly packed with less of that white ground substance in between. And then we have our wavy elastic fibres. So again, still a little bit more ground substance, but they're nice and tightly packed compared to the loose connective tissue. So our regular dense connective tissue is made up predominantly of the collagen fibres, the nice thick strong fibres arranged in those parallel bundles, and it resists pulling forces from a single direction. So the two best examples of that are tendons and ligaments. So when we go into the labs this semester, or if you've ever looked at a cadaver or an image of a tendon or a ligament, you will see there's very fine lines running in one direction, and that means it's really strong in that one direction. So if say your bicep is pulling on your lower arm bones, in that angle of pull, so going in one angle, it will be really, really strong. If I blow my arm from the side, if I attack it from a different angle, the tendon's not going to be that strong because it doesn't have those nice parallel collagen fibers running in that direction. So often we can do damage to our ligaments and our tendons when we get a knock from a direction that we weren't expecting. Our irregular dense connective tissue is again also made up of predominantly our collagen fibers, but this time not arranged in parallel. Because it's not in parallel, unlike our regular dense connective tissue, it is resistant to forces from different directions. So think the deep layers of our skin, the sclera, which is the white of the eye, the periosteum, which is the outer layer of our bone, and the submucosa, which is just a layer of our digestive tract. So all of those different types of tissue are going to need to withstand force from lots of different directions. And then our elastic dense connective tissue, so composed mostly of elastic fibers, obviously, and its primary function is that ability to stretch and recoil. So think about the layers within the walls of the arteries and within the walls of the lungs. So cartilage was one of our specialized types of connective tissue, and it can be divided into 3 different types of cartilage. We have our hyaline cartilage, our fibrocartilage, and our elastic cartilage. I couldn't unfortunately get a photograph of these different types of cartilage, but our hyaline cartilage is a very smooth, clear looking, almost glass looking type of cartilage, and you can see it on the ends of bones. So if you've ever given your dog a marrow bone and you have a look at the ends, and it's almost like ice. It's really, really smooth and clear and slippery. That is your hyaline cartilage. Our fibrocartilage is more dense, and its function is to resist compressive forces. So think about the meniscus between the bones at the knee joint. They need to resist a lot of force from the tibia and the femur kind of butting into each other. We then have our elastic cartilage, and as the name suggests, it needs to have a degree of stretch or flexibility. So our hyaline cartilage is glass-like, it's translucent, and it's avascular. Now this is important because when we damage cartilage, it has a very poor repair rate. So because we don't have any blood vessels to bring in the cells that we need to repair that area, the ability to repair cartilage is actually really quite low. This type of cartilage is primarily made up of those collagen fibers, meaning that it's going to be nice and strong. So the function of hyaline cartilage is to provide structure with limited flexibility. So think about your nose, think about your trachea. So if you run down your hand or your finger down your neck, your trachea is your windpipe. It's very hard to push that in too hard. The articular cartilage, so that's the cartilage at the end of the bones that I talked about when I said, did you ever give your dog a marrow bone? It's that smooth cartilage. And then also the embryonic skeleton. So when we are babies, our skeleton is actually made up of hyaline cartilage before it transfers into bone. Fibrocartilage is much more white looking. So again, when we come into the labs and you have a look at some of the cadavers, look at the fibrocartilage. It's a lot darker and more dense. It's arranged with really tight bundles of mostly collagen fibers, and it acts to resist weight bearing and compression forces. So for example, our intervertebral discs, so those are just the discs that sit in between the vertebra, the meniscus of the knee, and then the pubic symphysis. So that's the little bit of cartilage that sits in between your two hip bones. Your two hip bones. They all undergo a lot of compression and a lot of weight bearing. So this fibrocartilage ensures those bones aren't rubbing up against each other. We then have elastic cartilage, and this is chondrocytes within an elastic and collagen fiber network. So not just collagen fibers, it also has a large portion of those elastic fibers. It provides strength while also providing elasticity, and it typically maintains structure in non-weight bearing structures. So think about your ear. So you can kind of grab the external part of your ear and bend it and make funny shapes with it, but then it will spring back to its normal shape. Your epiglottis is also elastic cartilage, so that's the little part that covers your trachea or covers your windpipe when you're swallowing, so food doesn't go down into your lungs. And then your larynx, or the region near your voice box, is also elastic cartilage. So non-weight bearing, but needs to be able to maintain its structure. Then we also had bone as another specialised type of connective tissue. I'm sure you are all aware what bone is, and we're going to cover the skeletal system and bone actually in the next 2 lectures, so we won't talk about that too much today. But our bone is made up of those osteoblasts and osteocytes within a mineralised or a hard extracellular matrix. So we deposit lots of calcium and phosphorus into that ground substance. It makes it really nice and hard. And that's what gives the bones that structural support. And lastly, we had our blood. And so our blood is the final type of specialised connective tissue. And it's that little bit of an anomaly within the connective tissue world because 1, it is fluid. And 2, because it has ground substance, which is the plasma, and the cells, which are our red, white, and platelet cells, but it doesn't have those fibres, allowing it to be in that fluid form. So that is the end of the lecture, but I just really want to really quickly bring you back to this slide because this figure almost covers everything that we've talked about today. So the different types of connective tissue, what each type is made up of, a function for each of these different types, and then all the different classifications, as well as that they all derive from this common embryonic tissue. So, as I mentioned earlier, to be successful in this unit, you really need to find what works best for you in terms of studying. So it could be drawing a diagram like this, or simply studying a diagram like this. Just have a look over this and do you understand every part of that image. It could be listening to the lecture over and over and writing out your notes. It could be going online and looking at some really good YouTube videos, but you need to find what works for you. Having taught this unit for quite a number of years now, I do have lots of suggestions, and each week I will pop up those suggestions on Canvas. So these aren't activities that I require you to do or that you're expected to do. They're just suggestions. So if you feel like you're struggling in a particular area or you just want a bit of inspiration of how to study a particular topic, this is your first place to go. Here is what I would suggest. So thank you very much for tuning in again. I hope you can walk away from today with a bit of a basic understanding of what connective tissue is, because it can quite often be very confusing and overwhelming and something that people just brush to the side. For the next lecture, we're going to be diving into our body systems, starting with the bone and skeletal system for the next lecture. I hope you have a nice day and you will hear from me then. Thanks.